So, folks, take a look at this. This is an interesting development on the Online News Act, the Bill C-18 that passed, that is restricting people from sharing articles on social media sites. And while Trudeau is doing the theatrics of waving his fists and saying, "You MAGA people," not MAGA people, "You MAGA people," although he is shaking his fist for that too. Here's an interesting side note that just got released. So apparently Google is exempt from the Online News Act for 5 years. Must pay news outlets $100 million according to the CRTC, which is the Canadian Radio Telecommunications Council. And the Online News Act was implemented as this measure to try to get social media giants like Facebook and X and Instagram and all these different outlets that a lot of people access their news from to somehow pay up to these news outlets that were creating this content. I argued that it was kind of stupid that they were doing this measure, and the fact that you're restricting, not only you're restricting viewers from seeing these articles, but the journalists that are publishing this content, and a lot of them, mostly independent journalists, that have to use resources like Facebook and X and Instagram, social media to reach an audience, are completely screwed by this. Completely screwed by this. So how are you expecting to get more viewership and more favorability of people coming towards your sites if you're not allowing them to be published on social media sites? And the fact that you're angry at social media sites when in hindsight, for the last how many years, you coordinated together. Social media sites and the Canadian government coordinated together on things like COVID, censoring people that were spreading information on COVID, or spreading information about the Ukraine war, or spreading information about the 2020 U.S. election. You were silenced by that. The government applauded that, but all of a sudden, now you got to pay your dues to this media outlets because we got to protect the journalists. That's the important thing. That's what they want to scam you with. We got to protect the journalists. Even though they gave huge bailouts to places like Bell Media and the CBC, which are two of the biggest conglomerates in media industry here in Canada. And where did that money go? It went to the top CEOs. And the rest of the employees at Bell Media and CBC got screwed over hard. So, this is all just an absolute disgrace. So it says the Canadian Radio, Television, and Telecommunications Commission has granted Google a 5-year exemption from the Online News Act, ordering it to pay $100 million to Canadian news outlets within 60 days. Google agreed last year to pay Canadian news publishers $100 million a year in order to be exempt from the law, which compels tech companies to enter into agreements with news publishers. Google has tasked the Canadian Journalism Collective with distributing the money to news outlets. The CRTC says it believes Google has met the requirements for an exemption, but has added stimulations to its decision, including that it must allow more news businesses to join the collective. News Media Canada, which represents hundreds of publishers, had previously raised concerns that there was a lack of critical information about the Canadian Journalists Collective, including its governance and how it will be calculate payments and distribute funds. That would be something I'd be asking, considering the fact that, Catherine Tate, who was the former CEO of CBC, when testifying the fact that she stole all the bailout money that was supposed to go towards the employees at CBC, she took that money and said, well, I had to go over to, France for the Olympics, and I had to pay for this luxury hotel room, and it had to come from that money. I had to do it for the network. I had to do it for the network. Well, I mass fired a bunch of, employees that actually run the television studios that operate. Same with Bell Media. They took that money and they ran with it. They were supposed to distribute that to its employees that actually functions Bell Media and gives Canadians their content, But no, they never got scrot from that. The Canadian Journalism Collective submitted plans for its governance structure to the CRTC in July. But there's not really any sort of measure to that. But this guy, Dan Knight, points out, and he did a full thread on this, says, breaking, in a world where online platforms have become critical for the distribution and consumption of news, the Canadian government has made a perplexing move. The recently passed Bill C-18, also known as the Online News Act, requires Google to pay for merely displaying links to news content. Google's response? They've announced that they'll remove links to Canadian news from their search, news, and discover products once the law takes effect. Why does this matter? Well, first, let's examine the nature of the internet and the way we consume news. Online platforms like Google have democratized access to information, breaking down barriers and providing a global platform for news publishers to reach audiences that they can never before. I mean, that's debatable. That's debatable at this point because Google, is definitely in bed with censorship. Google's definitely on board with anything that sides along with the CIA, the military-industrial complex, anything that disrupts big businesses, big pharmaceuticals. We know that Google firsthand has censored a lot of content on YouTube. When YouTube was bought out by Google, we know that Facebook does similar things. The only real measure, the only real kind of measure of enacting some sort of free speech, and I kind of use that term lightly because even as a platform like X, where I'm reading this from, does have restrictions. Elon Musk has pandered towards, Israel, for example, or anything to do really deep dives into that. But at least Elon Musk is willing to provide the first step into free speech on a platform like X. So we're able to have this conversation. By requiring payments for links, Bill C-18 undermines this fundamental principle. The Canadian government, led by Heritage Minister Pablo Rodriguez, seems to have overlooked the fact that these links, which they now want to tax, serve as gateways to news sites themselves. Google, or any other search engine for that matter, does not host the news. It simply points users in the direction. Now, if those directions are removed, how are users supposed to find their way? And that's exactly what I explained, and that was my argument against this bill, is you want people to see your content. You want people to access your reports, access the things you wrote or you broadcast. How are they going to do that if you're restricting them from looking at social media? How are you going to get more eyes and viewership or readers if you can't publish that content on Facebook, if you can't publish that on Google, if you can't publish it on YouTube? How are you going to get that message across? What's more, the notion of this link tax exposes Google to uncapped financial liability. This isn't just a business concern, it's a dangerous precedent. If governments can impose fees on the facilitation of information access, what's to stop them from extending this principle to other areas? And that is what's happening with the censorship acts. That's what happened right after C-11, the Online Streaming Act, that imposed measures on podcasters and people like me that are providing this content to you. Then they went on to C-18 to tackle on journalism and tackle on the news industry. Now they're, almost halfway to passing the C-63 bill, which is the Online Harms Act, which is going to violate people's constitutional freedom of speech, their charters and rights and freedoms of Canadians, to battle down on people's posting things online. We're already seeing people getting arrested in Canada for posting content online. And they're claiming it's harmful, it's hate speech, when they don't even have clarification on what hate speech is. And the reason for all this measure and the reason they're doing all this is because the fact that the oligarchy is losing control of the narrative. And when you lose control of the narrative, they have to do swift action to silence people out. And if they can't silence people out quick enough, which they're trying to do here in Canada, then you go into the extreme measures the United States is taking, where they're actually forcing the DOD to attack their own civilians. That's not a hyperbole. That's actually fact. They passed a motion that gave the military opportunity to take down civilians, take down Americans. Why? Because God forbid they're sharing information on the internet that may be compromising, that may be critical to the oligarchy that wants to rule over them. And that's why all this is coming out. And this is where I've been saying from the start, you have to be principled when it comes to free speech. You have to understand that any means of censorship, even if it's just a little bit, even if you just want, Alex Jones to get out of there because you don't like what he says, that is going to open the floodgates for even more damage, just like this. Because if they can do it to Alex Jones, they can do it to anybody. Anybody. And that's what they're doing right now. That's what they're doing right now. They did it to Julian Assange. They're doing it to Alex Jones. They're doing it to other podcasters. I lost my original channel during COVID. I had to restart from square one. I'm being supplemented here on YouTube. That's why I've been trying to post on Rumble and TikTok and all these different platforms myself. This is why. Because it will extend as much as possible because they are so desperate to cling on to control of that narrative. Controlling that narrative means you control the culture, you control the people, and they don't want to lose that. And being that the internet is the Wild West of things, they are panicking over this. They're panicking the fact that places like Joe Rogan exist. They're panicking the fact that YouTube has these, commentators. They're panicking the fact that Rumble exists. They're panicking the fact that Elon Musk is opening the doors for more speech on X. And that's why they're making these huge, just insane jurisdictions to combat people on this. So Rodriguez and the Liberal government claim that this bill is meant to support Canadian journalism. However, what we see is a government caving into pressures of the news lobby, rather than considering the wider implications for its citizens. In this digital age, Canadian users have become accustomed to the ease of finding news through platforms like Google. Removing that capability does not support journalism. It creates barriers. That's exactly it. That's exactly it. And considering majority of people get their news from Google or Facebook, or if I get my news from X, and if they're putting on these restrictions, how are people going to find these stories? How are people going to find information and draw viewership or draw readership to your publications, to your outlets? It makes absolutely no sense. Absolutely no sense. And this is the argument I've always made about this. But they passed it anyway. Why? Because they want to control narrative. They want to restrict the access of information to people, to force people into going into their direction. It's nothing to do to save journalism whatsoever. We need to question the competency of a government that views the throttling of information access as a win for its people. Sure, the news industry has faced challenges with the rise of digital media, but the answer is not to cling to outdated models and penalize innovation. Rather, it's to adapt and evolve. Bill C-18 is not just a misstep, it's a step backward. Instead of fostering a more connected Canada, this legislation risks leaving Canadians in the dark. That's a loss for everybody. The government needs to reconsider its approach for the sake of its citizens and the future of news consumption in Canada. Well said. Well said. To get that from a guy on X here, and I believe he's actually a journalist, but I'm not totally sure on that. He has the blue check, so Must be considered high up there. But that's the whole point of that. That's the whole point of that. And the fact that now Google is exempt for only 5 years, trying to like cookie cutter themselves into saying that like, okay, Google can get out of this, but still we're going to create a tax for people that click on links to hear story. It's so crazy. It's so crazy for this to happen. It's so unbelievably crazy. Like the whole notion of Bill C-18, the whole notion of Bill C-11 was crazy. And the fact that Bill C-63 is almost coming to pass. I think it passed House of Commons just recently. Now it's at the Senate. So this is alarming. This is alarming. Like, we're starving our people. We're silencing our people. This is when comic book supervillains take control of the world. When you silence out the people, when you starve the people, when you restrict them, when you prosecute them from trumped up charges, send them off to prison because they posted something. You know, we don't want those keyboard warriors to be exposed, like the UK would say. Just unbelievably crazy. And you name a time, I always tell people this, the people that are accepting censorship, may not even be like, not cheerleading, but accepting to censorship. I tell them, when has there been time in human history, throughout all of civilization, that censorship actually made things prosperous? Because we wouldn't be here today with the technology, with the understanding of the world, with everything that we have right now. We would not be here today if things were completely censored out. We would not be here today. The theory of relativity from Albert Einstein wouldn't exist with censorship. The Galileo's understanding of space, that would not exist. Leonardo da Vinci's inventions would not exist. Nikola Tesla and his inventions would not exist. Thomas Edison, Plato, Socrates, Voltaire, you name it. We wouldn't be here with these measures in place. But now we're doing it in 2024 because the higher oligarchs have been sitting in their ivory towers and lying to you deliberately for the past how many years is finally caught up to them, and they're being caught red-handed. So now they have to silence more people out. And when they can't silence people enough fast, that's when the United States does the most extreme thing and announces that the DOD will attack their own citizens. Now, hopefully that doesn't happen in Canada. God forbid. That'll be just absolutely gruesome, because what we saw with the truckers was already horrific enough. Imagine RCMP, OPP, any sort of law enforcement just breaking down doors of random people that are online chatting with friends. Imagine if they break into your house for having a private phone conversation with someone because they don't like the conversation that you're having with that person. Like, this is stuff you hear from, the 1940s Germany excerpt. This is Gestapo. This is stuff you'd hear Soviet Union era, totalitarian, communist, whatever you call it. This is authoritarian overruling. This is 1984 Brave New World stuff. And it's happening now. So, this is why people need to wake up to this. This is why people need to, follow this and be angry about this. I'm angry about this. And I'm angry at the fact that it's hurting journalism. It's not protecting anybody. Just like how C-63 is not helping kids. It's making it worse. All it's going to do is restrict people's access of information, restrict people from having their own opinions, and restricting people's rights away for authoritarian measures, which is exactly what oligarchies want. They want you to get angry enough, they want you to get paranoid enough, so you surrender your will, surrender your rights to this unruly mob. And we're seeing it out in the open, and I don't know how far it's going to get worse before people really start to make noise.